Welcome to the Melbourne Press Club. I'm Mark Baker, the club CEO. I'm delighted to welcome our guest of honour today, my former age colleague, Annabel Crabb. Welcome. Annabel is, of course, one of our best-known commentators on national politics, and most remarkably, someone who can routinely find humour in that humourless wasteland that is federal parliament. And she is perhaps unique among our commentariat in that she is able to give our pollies the rounds of the kitchen, both literally and figuratively. I'm pleased also to welcome author, columnist and editor-at-large of the Nine Network's Future Women, Jamila Rizvi, who will lead the conversation with Annabel a little later. We're here, of course, to celebrate the release of Annabel's latest quarterly essay, Men at Work, Australia's Parenthood Trap. Jamila has tweeted that this should be formally issued as an essential text for new fathers and fathers-to-be. So all of you young dads in the audience, and I'm delighted to say that we have at least 18 fathers who are on parental leave at the moment in the audience, so that's commendable. So all of you dads, you've got about 20 minutes to speed read this before the heat is on. A warm welcome also to our sponsors whose support enables the work we do at the Melbourne Press Club. Principal sponsor, Virgin Australia, will be represented today by Senior Public Affairs Manager Mel Ward, and Monash University, represented by Corinna Henty. Our premium sponsors, Minter Ellison, David Polton, Crown Resorts, Alicia Gleeson, and the Commonwealth Bank. And also our major media and major corporate sponsors, all of whom you'll see featuring on the sponsor board. One thing I'd also like to mention before we eat, and that is that our next event, which we've just confirmed today and started marketing today, bookings will be open on our website later in the afternoon, but on the 2nd of October we'll be hosting John Fain, who's having a lunch event with us to mark his departure after 23 years as the presenter on ABC Morning Radio here in Melbourne. Now, John has noted that he'll probably get a very strong turnout for this event because a lot of people will want to make sure that he's actually leaving and also sees the possible opportunity of having a last word. But that should be very entertaining. Unfortunately, John Cleese, who last time John Fain appeared on the stage at the Melbourne Press Club was in partnership with John Cleese, and you'll see on the brochures on your table, we had a terrific cocktail event some years ago when Cleese came to the Melbourne Press Club, but unfortunately John can't be here. John Cleese, that is, this time around, and we're delighted that Mary Guerin will lead the conversation, the last conversation hour, as it were, with John Fain on the 2nd of October. So look forward to seeing some of you at that. Everybody, of course, welcome to that and to all Melbourne Press Club events. So our guests of honour will be back a little later, so enjoy your meal and thank you.
My name's Jamila Rizvi and I'm going to be your host for this afternoon's conversation with the wonderful Annabel Crabb. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and note, of course, that the traditional owners have been telling stories as well as managing the messy business of working and caring for children on this land for many tens of thousands of years. How many people, before we get started, have had a chance in the 24 hours since it's been out to have a read of Annabel's essay? Oh, look at the well-behaved journalists at the front. Okay, good. This is excellent because we can give you a good flavour of what's to come and leave you all with some good bedtime reading. Spoiler alert, Annabel opens with a story about the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and what happened when Jacinda announced her pregnancy and the headlines that raced around the world. She also compares it with what happened when Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg became Prime Minister and Treasurer, the first duo since the 1970s to take on these roles while bringing up primary school-aged children and younger. And yet that detail passed rather unnoticed. The only journalist that I saw ask the question of how on earth they were going to manage it all was Annabel Crabb. What did they say?
Well, I sort of privately bitched and moaned about the fact that nobody had asked them, because I sort of thought, well, if at the end of that crazy week of events, Kelly O'Dwyer had strolled away as Treasurer or Prime Minister, the press conference would still be going about, how is all this going to work, and, you've got kids and whatever. And so I fumed a bit for a couple of weeks. I thought, no one's asking these guys how they're going to manage these giant jobs and these little kids. And then I thought, well, that's a bit stupid, so just you can ask, because you are, after all, journalists. So I did. I rang them both and said, so how are you going to manage everything, with these little kids and the big jobs? And the interesting thing was, and look, by the way, Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison are both highly engaged fathers. They're incredibly besotted. I'm not running down their devotion to their children, but it was just interesting to me, the mechanics of how they answered, because I've asked women that stuff a million times before, and you find that working women who are balancing children and work have this almost like they've got like a little laminated card in their purses that they whip out, and they're like, well, on Monday, blah, 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 my parents help out on Tuesday, and then blah, 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 blah. But the guy's answer was very, it was obvious they hadn't really been asked it before, which is so fascinating given that we were so fresh from this global brain snap about what would happen when Jacinda Ardern had a baby while serving as Prime Minister of New Zealand, and, it would be a disaster, and, the last person to try that was Benazir Bhutto, and look what happened to her. And so I'm slightly distracted because for the first time I'm at an event where out the back there's two guys with their babies doing the jiggling, and they're like, hi!
Bravo!
It's so good. And I did not recruit them from Baby Central casting of adorability. They just came anyway, so welcome, chaps. I just, for me, that seemed like a really good example of this sort of strange double standard that we've internalised in Australia about, who we expect to do what in even, a modern relationship. It's perfectly expected and usual for women to change the way that they work when they have children. That's why we find it difficult to acclimatise to the idea that a woman with a really big job might spend heaps of time working at that big job and, outsource elements of parenting. But with men who have big jobs and little kids, their lives change hugely, and yet we don't expect them to change their working lives in any way at all, which is kind of sad, really. It's something that makes me feel a bit sad for those dads who never get asked. So I used to get cross when I'd pick up magazines that profile high achieving women who have families and big jobs, and the first question would be, how do you do it all? You must be amazing, you're a Wonder Woman, etc. I think, ask her about her job, you idiot. But actually, now I think that's a totally sensible question to ask, because in some ways it's the most human question to ask. How do you manage all this crazy stuff that you've got to deal with as a human being that gets, even harder if you've got a really hard job and a really little kid? Like, that's quite a sensible question. I just get cross now when men aren't asked it, because the issues are the same for them, and yet we seem to sort of pretend that they're not there.
I thought I'd better start with full disclosure. I've got a little boy, and my husband's here today, so can hold me to account. My answer to that question is that on a Sunday night I send a text message that says, these are the days you will do the pickup, and these are the days I will do the pickup, and these are the days you will do the drop-off, and these are the days I will do the drop-off. And then we have an army of babysitters from the Melbourne University Women's Club who we use to fill in all of the gaps, and we regularly rely on the neighbours, and we regularly shout at each other, often in front of our child. So that's the way we make it work, which is really helpful. And that's what I would have said were I Prime Minister or Treasurer and you'd asked me about it. But what I wanted to drill down on was why men are so unused to being asked these questions, because the responses you got from these two leaders were very worthy responses. They were responses about FaceTime and how they make sure they keep in touch, but they weren't that mental load stuff of how you make the week work.
Well, because I think the historic version of what the male employee is like is the ideal employee, right? Like someone who's available, round the clock, who, as their responsibilities scale up at work, they increase their hours, or, you know, they progress through a workplace, become more senior and become, you know, more available at all times. And that model is really predicated on, and I mean, men become more employable and more promotable when they have children, because in this sort of fatherhood premium kind of school of thought, being a father makes them more stable and more ambitious and so on. It's all predicated on there being a spouse at home that's picking up the rest of the stuff, which has historically been a fair assumption for men. But the truth is, in the last 50 years, women have changed the way that they manage their lives massively. I mean, it's only 53 years since federal public servants who are women were required legislatively to quit their jobs if they got married. And then, I mean, think about the absolute whiplash that women in that era got, because that was the case up until 1966, when the Holt government abolished that legislation. And then 6 years later, in 1972, here comes Gough Whitlam, who's like passed the act that gave female public servants not only the right to stick around and keep working, but to have 12 weeks of paid leave if they had a baby, and up to a year of unpaid leave. So that was kind of an amazing evolution in a really short period of time. And women have really kind of got stuck in and changed the way that they work, have moved into work at an enormous rate. And in Australia, we have a really high rate of part-time work, which is largely fueled by women. But the interesting thing is, over the same time, like, you'd think with women kind of moving out of the home and into work that there would be a kind of a rearrangement. But actually, men really haven't changed their work patterns very much. And, you know, like, we kind of have lots of discussions about stay-at-home dads and stuff, but the hard data across Australia says that the male behaviours really haven't changed very much at all. In 1991, there were 4% of families had stay-at-home dads. It's now 5%. Like, it's kind of what Newspoll, back when we still read it, was describing as within the margin of error, right? And so it's kind of like a static situation. And there's one graph in this essay.
I was just about to ask you to talk about that graph. If anyone wants to have a look, if you're a visual person, page 11.
Page 11.
I've helpfully looked it up for you.
The unique position of having everybody brought their homework, like, so you can all flip to page 11. So have a look at the one graph. This graph is composed by this brilliant researcher called Jennifer Baxter. She works for the Australian Institute for Family Studies. She's an absolute genius, and she really pays attention to men and their experience in parenting. I find her a really valuable researcher. And anyway, she compiled this graph, which is basically just the average experience in Australia of men and women after the birth of a child and through to the age of 12. Now, as you can see in the women's graph, it looks like one of those ER charts of someone having an actual nervous breakdown or heart attack. There's like spikes and valleys everywhere, as you can see. The mum's paid work goes straight down and never really recovers fully over the 12 years. Her childcare goes straight up. Fair enough. She's breastfeeding. That's okay. And then her domestic work goes straight up and kind of stays that way. She's doing more
forever and ever.
Whereas dad is kind of like, do you know what, I'm just going to keep on working. I'll be doing the same amount of paid work, and I'll also be doing about the same amount of domestic work, which is 15 hours a week. Weirdly enough, this is some sort of bizarre code to which Australian men have signed up without
15
any
hours.
Knowledge. Right. And that stays the same whether on average, it stays the same whether a man is in paid work or not in paid work, or whether his wife is in paid work or not in paid work, or whether there's a kid or whether there's... I mean, it's weird, but 15 hours is like the award rate. And no one was there for that negotiation, but that is really, weirdly, what the average experience shows statistically in Australia. I don't understand it. So anyway, I'm just making the point that that graph demonstrates so graphically, as graphs do, what the difference is in what is sort of the same biological event, I guess, or a similar one in a couple getting together, having a child.
And I think one of the things that's so striking about that graph is not just what happens immediately, because we all make these arguments about biology and, well, it's women that have the children and women are the ones that are breastfeeding, but it continues.
Right.
And what the point I think you make so well in the essay is that the patterns we set early are the ones that last ongoing in a couple's life.
That is super true. And it's helped by a lot of other factors as well, like, you know, the gender pay gap, for instance, means that it's more likely, you know, when a man and a woman get together and have a baby, that she'll be the one that takes the time off longer term because her income's less and so on. But listen, one thing that I do want to explain about the essay is that I wrote it because I had a few things knocking around in my head after I wrote a book about 5 years ago called The Wife Drought. And the questions were all about men and all about how we spend so much time, particularly, and this is sort of due to the massive and transformative power of feminism, looking at women and what their experience is like at work and like why aren't they, you know, like today's CW totting up of how many women there are, you know, in the ASX 200 running companies. Still six. I mean, it sort of jumps around depending on what Gail Kelly's doing or whatever, but, you know. We spend heaps of time looking at what happens with women and addressing programs to women and having mentoring and blah, 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 and breakfasts that nobody can bloody go to and that sort of thing. But really, there's a weird lack of time looking at men and like why men make the decisions they do. And I think that this discussion, particularly between two parents who are at the end of a busy day, pre their glass of Pinot Gris and, you know, kind of tired and emotional, it can really degenerate into a kind of like, you asshole, why don't you put in more kind of thing. And it's really kind of like, it's kind of dumb because I think there are actually really solid reasons why men behave the way they do, because even though your organisation might have an HR manual this thick saying, well, this is the parental leaves, and your flexible work is available, lots of men in lots of organisations, even if they read that stuff, they know on this sort of witchy, funny, unwritten level, that is not for me. And it's sort of like, so when the talk happens about the parental leave and the flexible work, it's like they're on a Virgin flight when they're like, I know you fly all the time, but do tune in to our safety regulations. They're like, nope, I'm not going to listen to that. It's a similar sort of thing because they know that there are different unwritten rules for men and women around this stuff. And that while if a woman is pregnant at work, in many organisations that we're kind of like, okay, right, so how are we going to manage this? And she's like, well, I'll come back part-time or whatever. That is a normal conversation to have with a woman and a less normal conversation to have with a man. There's a bit of like, oh, daddy daycare, hey? Oh, good for you kind of thing. Yeah. And so men know that there's different rules. And so I got quite interested in the last year or so just reading reports from the US about a bunch of cases that they've had there of men suing their employers because they applied for parental leave and were refused it. Now, the US is the only first world country left without a public paid parental leave scheme. Australia was the second to last. And in fact, our PPL scheme is among the most skimpy in the OECD, but it's lovely to have it. Thank you, Jenny Macklin. And it's been awesomely helpful for low-paid women who otherwise would not have had any kind of maternity leave. So it's awesome to have it. But in America, where there isn't a paid leave scheme, private employers often use parental leave as incentives for, you know, hiring good talent and so on, keeping talented people. But there's this rash of cases of men who have applied, and so there was one, JP Morgan Chase was the most recent one, where one of their brokers had applied for parental leave and been told, you know, under the policy, and been told, I'm sorry, it's not for you, it's for a woman, and unless you can demonstrate that your wife is physically incapable or mentally incapacitated, then you won't be getting this leave. And so he just said, well, screw you, I'm going to sue. And the company didn't hold
It's a very American response.
It is. I got to sue. Anyway, the company folded and settled and then set up this multi-million-dollar fund to recompense other fathers who had been rejected for parental leave. Anyway, so I've been reading about all this. It happened to CNN, a correspondent sued CNN successfully, Estee Lauder, a bunch of big companies. And I thought, interesting. There must be some cases in Australia because, in Australia, there are heaps of companies that really only hand out parental leave to women. There's still one or two companies that still have accouchement leave. Remember that? Accouchement leave. Anyway, so I rang Kate Jenkins because I'm lazy and I knew that she would know. And I did a bit of, Googling and couldn't find any cases. Ran Kate Jenkins, who's the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, and said, I'm looking for case law where have any men in Australia sued their employers because they got knocked back for parental leave? And she said, well, I don't think there'd be many cases. I'm like, why is that then? She said, well, because Section 31 of the Sex Discrimination Act actually legalises discrimination against men in this area. I'm like, are you for real? She said, yeah. And so it is true. Section 31 says nothing in this anti-discrimination legislation prevents any employer from making special rules for women around pregnancy and birth. Now, I can kind of see what happened in 1984. Lots of women flooding into the employment market and encountering all sorts of horrors, harassment, unequal pay. Thank God we fixed that. And all the rest of it. So that legislation is addressing problems for women, but decades and decades down the track, it's interesting because I think it becomes part of this array of legislative and cultural instruments that lay out a really clear guideline as to whose job it is to look after children and whose job it definitely isn't.
You referenced Jenny Macklin in there, who was very much the, I suppose, driving force behind the paid parental leave scheme that we have now, which hasn't really been changed all that much. Can you tell us about that scheme? She set out to try and make that as equal as possible, but there were still little things that kind of slipped through the cracks in the assumptions.
Well, when they drafted it, and it is amazing that Jenny Macklin got this legislation through. She started working on it in opposition, actually, and she got a lot of opposition from sectors of the union movement as well. So, it was a hard thing to do to make into Labor policy and then into government policy when Labor was in government in the middle of the global financial crisis. So it was, hats off that she got this through. It is a typical kind of achievement of Macklin's, who was a great sort of policy force within those governments, I think, often underrated. But they set the public paid parental leave scheme at 18 weeks, paid at the minimum wage. We don't have one of those glorious kind of Scandinavian systems where you kind of just have buckets of money and 54 weeks leave or whatever. It's pretty minimalist. And it's payable to the primary carer, right? Which pretty much, they use that gender-neutral language to account for same-sex couples, but it actually applies to the birth mother. So you're eligible for it to apply for it if you're the birth mother, and then under certain circumstances you can transfer the balance of it to your partner if that's the way you want to do it. But it's quite tricky to do, and essentially the underlying message in this thing is, well, this is for women and this is for mothers. And adding to that impression is that the ancillary scheme of 2 weeks paid leave is called dad and partner pay, just so that it's lovely and clear who the primary carer definitely should not be. And we all follow suit. So in the 8 years that scheme's been up and running, 1.2 million women have benefited from that scheme, which is amazing. And in that time, it's been used by 6,250 men. So less than 1/2% of the number of women who have used it. And in the private sector, across private sector paid parental leave schemes, and of course not every employer by a long stretch has one, but of those that are in operation, about 1 in 20 users are men. So there is definitely a major gap. And I think part of it is, weirdly enough, and Kate Jenkins explained this to me, was back in the 70s when Gough invented this idea of having paid and unpaid maternity leave in the public system, it was set at sort of at 1 year. So that is kind of what women do in Australia. They think, I'll take about a year. And Jenkins made the point to me that that's quite significant because it takes up a period of breastfeeding and then another chunk of time, all of which habitually is taken up by the mother, which means that, you know, because I mean, if you've ever had a baby, you know that, or if you've ever had a baby for the first time, you know that nobody has any idea how to work that child, right? Like, I mean, there's this whole kind of like, oh, women know. They just know. No, they do not. They do not know. Everybody is an equal opportunity idiot when you have a baby. I mean, unless you've raised 13 younger siblings or something, zip, idea. But what happens with our system, which is where women commonly are the ones that take not just a couple of months off, but then usually the full year, 6 months to a year, is that they then get really good at all the stuff. And Australian dads who habitually take 2 weeks, which in our family always involves just hundreds of trips to the chemist and then building a flat pack shed for some reason. I don't get it, but always.
A shed for every child.
Yeah. Anyway, less said of that, the better. But and then Dad's back at work just working normally, although getting cried at down the phone a bit more. And then at the end of the year, what happens actually is, to some women who have taken over that period on not just the majority of childcare, but also all of this sort of household running stuff, they just go, holy shit, I don't think I can manage to pack in a job. You know, they work out their return to work on the basis of how much stuff they can cope with, assuming that they will continue to be coping with all of the home stuff. And that's how it rolls. And then a lot of people say, oh, next time he's going to take leave. But next time he doesn't, because she's only working 3 days a week. So, of course, it makes much more sense for her to take the leave. And that's how these patterns start and develop, and then it ends up with women having no superannuation. So that's awesome. Anyway, the point is that workplaces too are kind of complicit in this because they look to women to make these arrangements when they're having children. They don't look at men in the same way and say, and what are you going to do? Like, how are you going to manage it? So that's how the pattern kind of compounds itself, I guess.
Is there still also a cultural element where we expect women to do this kind of work and to do this kind of work, because it is work, do this kind of work without any kind of financial assistance because they're doing it out of love? In the same way that we think childcare workers shouldn't be paid that much.
Because they love it.
Because they love what they do. And you don't love, I don't know, corporate finance.
Not in the same way. I think that's right. I think, look, I don't know, human beings are totally predictable organisms, you know. We take our cues from what we see people around us doing, and at work, we don't work out what we do or don't do from reading the HR handbook. I mean, who's ever read an HR handbook? Sorry, HR people, but nobody. You make your decisions based on what people are doing around you, and particularly if you have a baby, like, it's the most vulnerable moment in your life, because you've just realised that you don't know how to do anything, and also that you're now a hostage to fortune, and for the next, I don't know how many decades, you're just going to be lying awake worrying about what could happen to that kid. You know, now is the time when you're going to look for patterns and follow those patterns. So the interesting thing is, even though culture is really hard to change, and people often ask me, oh, what could the government do? Man, I don't know, like, there are some things that the government could do, but this is all stuff that we teach each other in workplaces. And the thing that makes me really optimistic, actually, is that it is quite easy to change these behaviours just by being aware of the patterns and thinking, well, how would it work if we changed the message that we send to people? Because, I mean, the crux of it for me is, like, I've had 3 kids. I've changed the way that I work with every kid. Like, when I had my first kid, I was working for the Herald, and I was, like, driving back and forth from Sydney to Canberra with my kid. Like, it was, and then I got pregnant again. I'm like, whoa, I can't do that anymore. Also, newspapers are hard if you've got a baby and you're looking after the baby, because newspapers have the same, you know, vulnerable time of day as children. Like, get really whiny and demanding at about 6 p.m. Like, everybody's IQ and EQ just slumps at about that time. It's all happening at the same time. Ooh, can't manage that. So I've changed the way that I work to reflect the way my life has changed. And even though I have wept a bit along the way, it's made me do some things with my job that I wouldn't otherwise have done. It's made me keep changing, which I actually find really useful. And one thing that I feel sad about for men is that, you know, they don't get that opportunity to have an enforced break from work, which makes you think, oh, actually, I hate my job, or here's what I could change. And lots of people come back from a break from work full of ideas about what they can change or what they'd like to do differently, and that's actually quite an amazing gift. Plus, there's so much evidence showing that the more involvement a dad has early on in life when everybody's still hopeless at babies, it means you sort of learn together, and that father's involvement ongoing in their kid's life is much increased. Also, the other knock-on effect is that in households where men have played a greater role earlier on, you get a more equal division of labour further in the household as well, which has a whole lot of knock-on effects for women's ability to return to work and participate in the workforce and so on. So it's kind of like a little Swiss watch, this whole operation, and it kind of makes me sad when I think that there are men who miss out, not because they don't want to be involved with their kids' lives, but they feel that there's something stopping them from taking up the opportunity to work flexibly or to take parental leave or change the way they work to accommodate the changes elsewhere in their lives. And that's a really sad thing. But there are companies that are making decisions that are changing behaviours quite quickly, and that's what I find really exciting, actually.
My dad's a baby boomer, and he commented a few months ago that he spends more time with my son, who he lives interstate from, than he ever did with my sister and I. And I remember thinking, that is really sad. Like, that is a really sad reflection. But having said that, I compare his involvement with my sister and I to a lot of my male contemporaries today, and it's still not that different. That expectation around breadwinner status and you are a provider for this family now is so strongly entrenched and still sits on the shoulders of men. And the only couple amongst my friendship group where I see it completely differently, they live in Scandinavia. So we've come to that point where, for those of you in the room who are young parents, just close your eyes.
Yeah, I know.
You know,
the screams will be horrible to hear. Yeah,
try not to be jealous. Try to enjoy it. Tell us about what happens there in that magical place.
Well, the first thing to understand about Scandinavia broadly is that they have a different approach to social welfare from ours. And in the case of Norway, for instance, which is the most naggingly exemplary country in this respect, I mean, you know, they had the brains to put their minerals boom into a sovereign wealth fund so that they can be smug about forever. And we, of course, spent hours on flat screen TVs and will mourn it forever. But look, Norway in the 70s had a really low participation of fathers in parental leave, and so, as did we, but they worried about it in their Norwegian way and thought, well, how can we change this? So they changed, by about the 90s, they changed the rules of their very generous parental leave section and said, their parental leave policy, and they said, well, what about if we made one chunk of the parental leave available to each family, only claimable if the dad takes it? And that's kind of like an interesting piece of behavioural psychology, because it says, okay, dads, you've got this thing where you feel like you need to provide. How about if we present you with this situation where your family only gets this money if you're going to be at home with your kid? So it kind of allies those two forces. I would like to spend time with my children, I would like to be a provider, rather than making them work across each other.
It's like when I get my Country Road Spend and Save in the mail. And I'm like,
exactly
I should use
like
it,
that, Jamila.
or I'll miss out.
Many academics have made that point, the important line between the Country Road Spend and Save. But use it or lose it is a really powerful tool. So, I mean, Norway, yes, they introduced this thing, and then the participation of men in parental leave went up to, you know, about 40% really quickly. And there's actually, like, Germany recently retooled its scheme, which is called Elterngeld, parents' money, to incorporate a use it or lose it element. There's a couple of other countries have done the same. And that really does change behaviour really quickly. And I know you can sort of think, well, yes, but that's Scandinavia, totally different. But Canada has a really interesting example too. So Quebec changed, there's a sort of like a Canada-wide, Australia-style, but more generous parental leave public system. And Quebec decided, no, there's not enough men using it, so we're going to change it up. So that province changed its scheme to incorporate a use it or lose it, where you only get it if the dad takes leave. And because the rest of Canada stayed the same, they've been able to really study the differing behaviour of families.
Demographers everywhere going, ooh.
Oh my gosh, it is the absolute demographer's dream. And so a number of researchers immediately moved to Quebec. And of course in Canada they also have a really regular time use diary, which is the greatest statistical tool for measuring who does domestic work, because we don't measure it in any other way like paying for it or anything like that. So, and what they discovered from this Quebec scheme is that, yes, the participation of men really escalated after Quebec introduced this new scheme, A, and B, they were able to measure the rate of return to work of women who were in the families where the dads took the leave, and it was accelerated, and you also had a more equal division of domestic labour years down the track in those families. So sometimes it's just a question of tweaking something, and where I think it can be useful in big organisations, which are seriously the kind of engine room of cultural change in this respect, is there is lots of evidence from Australian examples that if companies sit down and look at the behaviour of everybody and put together a business case for extending parental leave and having men participate in it, what they find is that it does build loyalty, it builds confidence in the workplace. It costs you, a salary for 14 weeks or whatever, but the knock-on effects are actually quite significant. And once you make it clear that it is actually genuinely okay and available to men, and that is reinforced by seeing senior men take leave, then that behaviour changes pretty quickly.
Who's doing it well in Australia? Are there private sector companies that are leading the way, showing us how it could be done?
Well, the example that I spent a lot of time on in the essay is Medibank. Now, they did something really different. They were privatised, as you know, in 2014. And when that happened, they changed buildings. And this was really significant because the leadership of the company decided that they wanted to change the workplace culture to a flexible work culture. And it's easier to do that when you're changing buildings, because they basically like, you with your desk and your plant and your little jar of snacks, you're going to be hot desking now. And people hate that for a bit, but you've got to be kind of really measured in the way that you introduce it, and you've got to make sure that everybody is kept up to speed with how it's supposed to work. But also, when you introduce that flexible work approach and you say, well, the work that you do is important for you getting it done, we don't care where you do it, then it does some interesting things, like it reduces the kind of workplace shame of the 10 to 3 scuttle. You know, where you sort of hang your cardigan over the back of the chair so it looks like you're still there. It's like, going to pick up the kids from school again or whatever. So that ushered in at Medibank this sort of culture of flexible working, and then they revolutionised their paid parental leave policy. This happened only about 18 months ago, and they knew that only about 2% of the people taking parental leave were men, and they also knew that their return rate was not great. Like, so they'd have people out for a year, and then a certain proportion of them would come back, but if they stayed out for 2 years, about 75% of them wouldn't return. And this is like an issue because they've trained all these people, invested in these people, and then lose them. So they kind of kicked around a few ideas, and then they decided to do something really radical, which is that they abolished the whole idea of primary carer. So, well, look, why is it in this modern age that we're still picking someone to be the lead parent? I mean, post-breastfeeding and whatever, why is it that somebody has to be the gold star parent that's responsible forever now? So they said, you know what? If a child comes into your life because you're the birth mother or the birth father, or you've got a surrogate or you're a foster parent or you've adopted, then you get 14 weeks paid parental leave. And you can take it all in one chunk, or you can take it in 2 chunks, or you can work 3 days a week until it's exhausted, or you can work 4 days a week till it's exhausted. You can start early, finish, whatever. And that seems to be the thing, and they marketed it to men as well, that really tipped the balance. And so in the 18 months since that policy was announced and introduced, their participation rate in long parental leave by men has gone from 2% to 30%. A really short time. And it compounds itself because these men kind of see other men taking it and not dying, which is how we basically learn about what goes at work, right? It's a kind of like walk the gangplank thing. How'd that go? Oh, all right. So you then get these clusters of other men doing the same. And look, it's just a really great demonstration, I think, of how these quite ancient ideas and cultures actually are capable of rapid change if you want it to happen and if you go about it the right way.
It's been, as you said, 5 or 6 years since you wrote The Wife Drought. Every woman, every working mum I know, why do we say working mum? Every mother who happened to have a job, which is most of them, I know, read that book and went, oh, yes. This is quite squarely aimed at men as well as women. It hasn't been long, but what kind of response are you getting to the essay from men?
Well, The Wife Drought was sort of written to be appealing to men too. And actually, when I was writing the book, it was so funny. People say, "What are you writing?" And I'd explain it, and I get this often from women. I'd say it's called The Wife Drought, and it's about how you really need a stay-at-home spouse to really function properly in the workplace. And every woman would say like, "I was going to write that book. That's my book. I had that idea." And then their husbands would be like, "I see. And is there any way that my wife can be prevented from reading this book?" Sort of thing. But actually, when men read it, they're like, "Oh, actually, this isn't a giant hack job on men. It's just like a kind of bit of a look at what's happening." And I really hope that this essay will work the same way. The great thing about Twitter is that it provides instantaneous reactions to often quite long pieces of writing without having to actually write them. And so there was an extract in over the weekend that was on the ABC website, which is like, why men don't take parental leave. And I got a bit of, what are we in trouble for now kind of, blowback from blokes. And I'm like, this is so funny because I'm expected to be the breadwinner. That's why, because everybody thinks that this is my job and, my wife spends too much money on shoes, etc. And I'm like, dude, you should read the essay because I suspect we're not even on different sides. Anyway. But what I am really heartened by is there's actually a big audience out there, it's not just this table, of dads that really are open to and hungry for working differently and, looking after their partners as well and recognising sometimes that the burden that gets chucked on mums with jobs can be quite profound. And the Diversity Council of Australia did some really interesting research a couple of years ago among millennial dads, showing that actually younger fathers are quite keen to work differently from the way their fathers worked. And the heartbreaking thing about it is that, the extent to which they say that they want to work like this. I mean, the most memorable stat from that report was that 79% of these millennial dads wanted to work a compressed work week, but only 25% of them were actually doing it. And if you discount whatever proportion of them were lying about wanting to do work like that, I mean, which some people argue, why would you want to do that? The fact that there's any gap between aspiration and reality at all is really sad, because this isn't about sort of social engineering. It's about recognising that every family should have the right to decide which way they want to organise their affairs. Sometimes it makes heaps of sense for one partner to do all of the breadwinning and one partner to do all of the home stuff. And, that really works for people some of the time. But the idea that there are families that make their decisions not based on what would really suit them and their temperament and their child and what jobs they do and whatever, but on the expectations of this sort of faceless workplace culture, is really sad, I think. So, and it's the enemy of freedom of choice.
We spoke at the start about programs that focus on gender equality or generally being aimed at women. And I know a lot of men who are interested in gender equality issues feeling like, oh, the International Women's Day breakfast, hey, I'm supportive, but I don't think I'm supposed to go to that. That's not for me. And I feel like with this essay, you've given a very express and explicit invitation to men to say, come to the table, let's discuss these issues because you're the ones who are being heard as well. With that, this is an explicit and express invitation to the room for you to ask a few questions. We've got about 10 more minutes of Annabel's time. So please throw up your hand and we will put your questions to Annabel. Be brave.
There's an intrepid first questioner at the back of the room. Thank you.
I'm just wondering if you've had the same issues with same-sex couples, particularly two men trying to bring up a child?
Well, really only anecdotally, right? And I cannot wait for the first wave of comprehensive research into division of labour in same-sex couples. I think same-sex couples struggle with the public paid parental leave scheme because it is geared towards a heterosexual relationship and being paid through the birth mother. So I know of same-sex lesbian couples that have been like, well, it doesn't, like birth mother, that where it's got kind of confusing. But look, my anecdotal experience and what I would expect those sorts of studies to show is that same-sex couples are more likely to make the decisions that suit them and their jobs and their children and where they live and all of those other things, and also the degree of desire of either partner to take time out of the workforce and where they are in their career and so on, to make their decisions free of those kind of gender expectations. But I really want to see that research when it happens.
Do we have any other questions? Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I'm Tully Smith. I work for the Telstra Corporation. So I'm quite privileged to have 16 weeks paid paternal leave that I can take within 12 months. I can take that in one go, or I can take that over in multiple blocks, and I can do that as a primary, or there's no primary or secondary, it's just parental leave. So I'm quite fortunate to have that. But I also come from a family of tradespeople, and I know my siblings and certainly my parents don't have that. Don't have that same culture that we at Telstra enjoy. So what can we do as a country to sort of extend that? I mean, the data at Telstra we're collecting is overwhelmingly positive that providing that 16 weeks paid paternal leave, for childbirth or for a child entering the life of any parent, is overwhelmingly so productive for our workforce. It's incredibly valued. So many people are taking it up. It's just, all the positives are there. But how do we get out and talk about that? How do we share it? Well, I mean, what do we do to change this culture?
Well, I think you raise an interesting point about different sectors of the workforce, and I think that there's actually, the lead is being taken very comprehensively in this sphere by professional services firms, white-collar employers. That's where it's really starting. And you can kind of understand that because they are jobs that lend themselves better to flexible work. I mean, Telstra's an interesting case, and in 2014, Telstra introduced All Roles Flex, which was a really, it was a major market leader in this radical idea that rather than going to your supervisor and arguing that your job should be able to be flexible, they made the assumption that all roles would be flexible unless, proven otherwise. And I think Telstra was really influential in this field. And Telstra's also interesting because it has a blend, it has different employees. It's got blue-collar and white-collar employees. If you look at the evolution of the way parental leave policy grows and gathers steam, when it comes to maternity leave, it started in the public service in 1972 with Whitlam, and then it was taken on by private sector organisations, driven by people like Anne Sherry and Heather Ridout, who had a really important formative role to play, and also driven by unions as well over the years. And then we finally got to the point in 2010 when we could legislate it as a public system. And I think that big organisations have the ability to drive cultural change in this respect. On blue-collar workers as well, it's really interesting to note that the Fair Work Act directs that workers have the right to request flexible work. They don't have the right to insist on it. Recently there was a variation directing that employers needed to provide good reasons for declining it. But I think that piece of legislation has got a little bit of updating to go. Like, I think that is a point at which we could engage legislatively with our culture of flexible work in this country.
I think we've got time for one more brave questioner. I'm going to go with whoever our friend with the microphone saw first.
This is just picking up on the last questioner's point about there being a potential divide between those who work at the leading companies and the white-collar jobs and making those benefits more broadly available to the Australian public. So I think you make a very clear and compelling case for the benefits that will bring. Is there a role for government in setting the policy agenda here, perhaps learning something from some of our Nordic friends, but also from Canada, in tweaking, because when paid parental leave was introduced, it was really thought of, and I appreciate that it was definitely a beast for Jenny Macklin to get through, and well done to her. But it was a no-frills policy, and I think that it was always seen as a starting point. And 10 years on, is it time to revisit that and take a page out of your book and think about some of the broader benefits and create a public policy setting that would really bring those benefits more broadly to dads everywhere, so we don't have to wait another generation before we get it?
I think there are definitely different signals that could be sent by government. You could do that legislatively by tweaking the scheme. You could, for instance, allow men to apply for parental leave directly. You could double the scheme and say that both parents should, where there are two parents, be able to have parental leave. Now, the scheme costs $2 billion a year at the moment, so there goes about a third of Josh Frydenberg's surplus, so that's a tricky consideration. But at the moment, it does send a really clear gendered message about who should be taking parental leave and who should be satisfying themselves with 2 weeks. And there are things you could do. If you didn't want to double the expense, you could make a portion of it, use it or lose it, or you could extend the time and make the extra time use it or lose it for the other parent. Like, there's a bunch of little twiddles that you could use, even though it is, in international terms, quite a cheap scheme to run. You could use some tweaks to send different messages to mothers and fathers. And historically in this country, this change is wrought by government policy and by private practice. And so I do think there is a great deal to be gained by some cooperative effort between the public, the private sector and policymakers to get in a row on what would be productive change and how you can use intelligent switches and behavioural design ideas to change the options that people think that they have.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in putting our hands together to thank Annabel Crabb.
Thank you, Jamila.
I'd also like to thank the Melbourne Press Club and Crown for hosting us today, and all of you for being here, particularly to the adorable 2 babies up the back, and the dads doing an excellent job keeping them so very, very quiet.
Yes, and on behalf of the club, thank you both for a fabulous conversation, Annabel and Jamila. Really thought-provoking, and congratulations, Annabel, on a wonderful piece of journalism. Clearly you've done massive amounts of research on this, and I sincerely hope that it triggers a comprehensive debate around these issues moving forward, as they say. This is a great occasion for the Melbourne Press Club, a bit of a first, multiple babies in the room. But I think we also have another achievement that we can record, and that is you can be a stay-at-home dad, and you can also do lunch. Thank you both.
Thank you.